Everyone. Thank you all for joining us for the February the 11th, 2021 Law Enforcement Policy Task Force meeting. We have a few announcements to make regarding this meeting. First of all, I ask all participants to stay muted until they are recognized to speak. Task Force members will be allowed to ask questions or comment at any time during the meeting. Please use the Zoom raise your hand feature if you are wanting to speak. Keep in mind that with a large number of members to call, we cannot always see you on the screen with your hand physically raised. So please use the raise your hand. That puts you in queue and I know which one comes next. If the video conference is disconnected at any time during the meeting shall be stopped and reconvene once the audio and video connection is restored. If communications are unable to be restored within 15 minutes, items remaining will be placed on the next scheduled meeting agenda. And for those of you who are watching, the agenda and documents are located on okc.gov, and I officially now call the meeting to order. Once again, it's good to see everybody here. We've had quite a bit of weather here in Oklahoma City, and it's very nice to see those of you who are able to join us today. I show first on our agenda is a community presentation by Black Lives Matter. And at this time, I'll call on Reverend Cherie Dickerson. Cherie, you're muted.
Cherie, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now.
Okay, I just had to use my actual finger. Go figure. I was careful in which one I used because it was on the screen. And I could not, I'm sorry, I could not hear what you all were saying because I was trying to get, there was some type of feedback on my laptop.
Oh, I just went through the meeting rules that I normally go through at the beginning of the meeting, Cherie.
It's still, I'm getting 1 second. I don't know what happened. Here we go. Okay, I'm sorry, MT, will you repeat that for me one more time?
Yes, I just went through the meeting rules, what we normally go through, the parts about keeping your audio source on mute and things along those lines, and what will happen if we have any audio or video failures during the meeting.
Okay.
Just our normal announcements. And then I turned it over to you.
Okay.
Your presentation.
All right, thank you so much. And I hope everyone can hear me okay. I don't know why I was having those complications arise because they were fine at first. And I can't tell if my colleagues, Mr. Harris Till and Higginbotham, if they are on yet.
No, I don't see them yet.
See. Okay, so Josh just sent a message and said he's trying to connect and it's not working.
Would you let him know that I'm resending him the link now?
Okay, will do.
Thank you. I sent them both the link.
Okay, I got a thumbs up from one, so hopefully they both will see that. And I'm gonna try to also pull up my notes here. One of the things that, the reason why we were wanting to do a presentation is basically an overview, starting talking about and presenting why we when we offered our list of demands back in June, and kind of a timeline of things that have occurred from then until now. And basically an analysis, of course, from our organizational standpoint of things that could have possibly have been different, as well as also explaining why many of the requests or demands on that list were actually made. So you're going to, we're also going to provide information that supports all of the things that we are speaking about. There will be, there is a, I'm trying to, it's not letting me pull it up. There will be a PowerPoint that you will be able to follow along with. And we can also provide all of our attributions if you need the information and documents that we're going to be presenting. But it's just talking about the main reason why we were here and why we asked for this was to decrease some of the results or fatalities that occurred within interactions with law enforcement, as well as options given that we felt would help with actually achieving just that. I can't tell if, I think one Josh is on. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Harris Teal, and he will get started, and then we will have Mr. Higginbotham that will also give some background information as well as an up-to-date analytic presentation.
Thanks so much for that, Cherie. So as we've been kind of exploring what a better society looks like in terms of relationships between the community and the police, we've been trying to put together kind of what we thought our ideas were and working with you all to figure out what your suggestions are. What I hope to get from this process is a lot of unrefined ideas that we can turn into something that is actually refined. Like Cherie said, we had a list of demands that we presented to the mayor. And I believe those were some really great ideas, but they may have been unrefined in a sort of fashion because of the fact that we need to make sure that they fit the city the best. And as we've been doing research, we've been providing more and more context on what we think might be the best for the city. So the first thing that we kind of want to cover is just what has happened since the police or since the protests and since we made those demands and since the creation of this task force. And for that, I want to turn it over to Josh. You're muted, Josh.
All right, there we go. So one of the things that we kind of need to talk about is exactly what has taken place in the city since the protests. And actually, I'd like to go back kind of further. And in looking at, I know that some people had problems with the mapping police violence side. I've heard, I think, Chief Gurley and a few others. The Washington Post actually has one that's called, I believe it is Fatal Force is the name of their project. And one of the things that is very, very difficult when it comes to police violence or officer involved shootings is that there is no database, right, that actually collects all of this sort of information. So they have to rely on media accounts, and that's essentially what gets compiled. And so what I decided to do was go back one calendar year before the last person was killed in Oklahoma City. And the last one that to date was February 4th. And so going back a calendar year, there have been 27 people in the state of Oklahoma who have been killed by police. 19 of those have come since the protests of June 1st, or May 31st, June 1st. There have been 7 in the metro area, and all 7 of those have come after the protests. which is kind of staggering. And if you look at each of the instances, even then, there's still not a lot of information on several. But one of the things that becomes pretty clear that we'll come back to toward the end is that a common theme is that a large number of them involve something like mental illness. And that's something that we want to touch on a little bit as far as programming and some of the ideas that we have.
Correct. A lot of you may remember, and for 21CP, we definitely want to make sure that we get the previous presentation over to you as well as this one. There wasn't a lot of data based consensus around de-escalation training. As a matter of fact, according to the International Association of Chiefs of Police, they found that there's no conclusive evidence that de-escalation training is effective. And two of the quotes that you all might remember from the last presentation is a review by Cynthia Loom and her colleagues in 2016 revealed that many of the recommendations of the president's task force at the time, including de-escalation training, are not based on a strong body of empirical evidence. And it also said, the only agreement among de-escalation training supporters and critics appears to be that more information is needed to determine its effectiveness. And that's from Ingalls and Serpas in 2017. We saw this year or last year, a report come out of the 2020 Conference of Mayors. And in that report, they said that we need to redefine the role of local police and public safety. We ask our police officers to protect our communities from crime and violence and to promote public safety. They play an essential role in our cities, but we are often asking police to be first responders on every scene. Although our police play a vital role, they are not always the best response. They should not be the only public response to every need in our communities. For example, mental health, homelessness, and domestic violence are just a few examples of challenges for which we need to rethink our response. Cities should also analyze all of the available data, including their residents' requests for help, to determine what the needs are and which resources should be deployed as the best response. And they should also understand the social services that those communities need most. Mayors should assess their city budgets, and in our case, the city council as well, including the budget of the police department, and determine how to best allocate funding to build the requisite resources. In terms of transparency and accountability, superb policies are of little use if they are not enforced. And public trust rests in large part on whether the public sees that their public servants are acting in accordance with those policies and are held accountable when they are not. And so when we talk about kind of trusting, rebuilding that trust in communities, one of the ways we've approached this is through the independent monitor. And I'll toss it back over to Josh to cover that.
So when the protests first occurred and we met with Mayor Holt, we handed him a pretty large substantive document that actually was the model contract between the New Orleans Police Department and the city of New Orleans for the independent police monitor. And it created actually a new office under the Inspector General there that created an independent body separate from law enforcement. And in the city ordinance, it talked about some of the qualifications they want for the person that would fulfill that office. And it's someone that had experience, hopefully with civil rights law, that could fill that particular office. But it would create it something that is different, that has maybe you would say like a bigger profile publicly than what just a citizens review board or something like that has. Our suggestion, and we've been talking about this for a while, kind of going back and forth, but that if anything, because of the lack of trust that exists right now between especially communities that tend to be over policed and the police, in our opinion, having an independent police monitor is going to help hopefully create some trust, create accountability, and also would be a place where you could have things like, for instance, you could have this office act as the conduit and almost like the receptacle for things like body cam footage, so that all of the body cam footage would now be reviewed and would be looked at, and suggestions would be made upon things to do or actions to take based on an independent review of body cam footage or of evidence from, officer involved shootings and things like that. So it creates, and again, it's something that, this is a model that has been in place since I believe about 2009 in New Orleans. And we developed this idea actually in conjunction with two researchers, a professor down at OU, and looking for something that might kind of fit also regionally, right? And New Orleans isn't Manhattan, right? It's a little more comfortable for people. And it also is a weak mayor system, which is similar to ours. So a lot of the city ordinance, the charter, some of the other things, structurally speaking, it wouldn't be as big a leap as what some other things that other cities have done would be.
Right. What we understand is not that de-escalation is problematic by any means, but that we don't have a strong body of evidence to tell us that the de-escalation training we're doing now is as effective as we need it to be for our community. We believe that the de-escalation training is very thorough, but we think that there is a point in time where there is a difference between de-escalation and use of force, where the use of force that is implemented is oftentimes greater or more extreme than it needs to be. When we take a moment to look at the balance between marksmanship and non-violence, I think we find that what we spend time instilling into our recruits, as well as instilling into the officers who are in service and the training they receive at that point in time, and is that 58 hours of recruit training is spent on firearms, right? Whereas 8 hours of that training is spent on de-escalation. When we think about de-escalation, when we think about crisis intervention, which is another 8 hours of that, when we think about communication skills, which is about 10 hours of that, we're looking at 28 hours of what we would consider de-escalation in comparison to 58 hours of what we consider to be marksmanship. We believe that marksmanship is necessary. We want to make sure that if an officer has to deploy their weapon, that their target is the only person who is hit in that situation. We don't want any stray bullets. We don't want any unnecessary casualties. But what we have to think about is if our focus is on marksmanship being so great that it doesn't negatively impact anyone else, should we not always so make sure that our de-escalation and our use of force policies are so instilled into our officers that they think that pulling a gun is the absolute last option? When we do an evaluation of some of those shootings that we've seen recently, we've seen officers deploying different levels of force. Some officers deploying lethal force, while some other officers were using less lethal forces or non-lethal forces, as some of you may know them to be referred to as. The fact that that isn't the same means that there is some policy or there's some program or there's some training that isn't adequately making sure that our officers are all on the same page when they're approaching those situations. The unfortunate situation with Stavian, we saw on video that there was a different use of force between officers there. The unfortunate situation with Benny Edwards, we saw that maybe there were a few steps we could have taken to try to evaluate that situation better, separate officers enough so that they weren't in harm's way, and get a professional, especially a mental health professional, who could get into that situation, assess what was going on, assess the needs, and make sure that we don't lose a resident of our community. We know that these videos being public deeply impact the ability of the community to look at officers and not feel a sense of fear. When we have that sense of fear between the community and the officers, that fear is felt by the officers and it puts them in situations where they might not act in the best interest of everybody in that situation. They might respond too harshly. We understand that they're humans, and this is something that can happen in those situations, but we want to make sure, I think that the quote goes he's a Marine friend of mine. He said, a quote he heard was, in times of crisis, you don't rise to the occasion. You sink back to your training. So if our training is so focused on the use of firearms, then sinking back to your training might automatically make you transition into the use of firearms instead of transitioning into the use of de-escalation training.
Well, and to add to that, I think the other important thing to note is that even with the so-called de-escalation training, right, which is not validated as a best practice, it's not quantified as something that necessarily helps. I mean, it might, but we don't have the evidence to show that it does. The problem is that maybe officers aren't the ones that were best suited to make the call in the first place. And what that means is that, and that's why we mentioned some of what we did from the Conference of Mayors, is that we need to look at the city's budget differently. Maybe we are, I mean, clearly, and I think a lot of police officers would feel the way that they are being asked to respond to numerous situations that it wouldn't matter how much training you have. And particularly when we're talking about people with mental health issues, someone who is armed coming into that situation, and especially a few people that are armed coming into that situation, it does not de-escalate it just by its very nature. An armed officer like coming into the situation escalates things. So that maybe, and as we've seen, and this is one of the things that we'll be providing some information on, there are some other programs that have been tried. One that just published their first report in Denver called the STAR program, that was based on a program in, I believe in Oregon, Eugene, Oregon, that was called Cahoots, that has become pretty popular. Now, this was a grassroots community organization that had some mental health workers who tried to go out to various places where there were incidents that, had police been the ones to respond, things could have gotten violent very, very quickly. And instead, they have piloted some of these programs in other places. I think there's also one in Oakland right now. But the one in Denver, I wanted to talk about some. They had been, for about the last year and a half or two, this had actually sort of been in place when things, when you had the protests that happened in May and June. They were already in the process of getting this going. They had one unit that went out and worked from, I believe, 10 a.m. to 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. every day. On average, they had 6 call outs every single day. They ended up having 768 over the course, I believe, is about 8 months, 768 call outs, and not a single one of those resulted in an arrest. Now, these were calls that before this program was in place, police would have responded to, right? And instead, you have unarmed mental health workers that responded to these calls. And the overwhelming majority of them, I believe 41%, were mental health related, right? Sending police officers into that situation doesn't help anyone, including the police officers. It's a misallocation of resources as a city. And so we have to look at doing other things with the budget that we have. And there you have some data, right? We have, what we're saying is that we don't need to retrain or give another, crisis intervention training or spend money on something like that. We have mental health care professionals who instead need to be dispatched out to these situations, and who can make determinations of whether or not police need to come out. Apparently, in no situation did they actually need that added backup and support, right? On 768 separate calls, which is pretty incredible. But they were able to get and arrange people the sorts of services that they needed. Now, and I just want to say, this kind of hit home when looking back over the number of individuals in the state of Oklahoma, and particularly the 7 people in the metro area since the protests had occurred. And even if you just look at the last three, the last two, mental health issue was definitely involved, right? Had there been a program in place like Cahoots or a STAR program, I mean, you have to wonder, how would that have changed the outcome? You know, we could end up with something very, very, very different, which is important.
And I really want to break down those last three for us, because I think those are really important, and kind of, you know, maybe approach them from what we believe would be the community's perspective. So on the 4th of February, Tilford Bratton, a 30-year-old man with a gun was shot and killed. It's a mental illness situation. There was no body camera recording, and there was undetermined if he had been fleeing. The information we got is that Ritter and other officers at the Oak Lane address reported shortly after 11 p.m. in response to a mental patient medical call. Ritter responded just after 11 p.m. to 1600, and a report of a person who was armed, who had a mental illness. Police had initially said officers were responding to reports of domestic disturbance, which kind of, again, creates this uncertainty within the community. And Stewart said Sergeant Ritter fatally shot Barton, while the other officer, a trainee, and the other officer who was a trainee, did not open fire. And so in that situation, we have to ask those questions on what does the training look like, in which one officer responds one way and one officer responds another. We know we want to take into experience that, something that there's a lot of officers been in these situations before who feel like they know kind of which direction it's going in. Is that something that we can trust, that experience? And if it is something that we can trust, then why are we not making sure that our trainees are receiving that same training so that they can have that same kind of thought process there? On the 11th of December, it was Benny Edwards, 60-year-old Black man armed with a knife, shot with a stun gun, and then shot and killed eventually by OKC PD. This was an obvious mental health issue. We didn't see if there was a body cam recording. There is debate on whether or not Benny was charging at the officers, which some have said, or trying to flee the situation, which others have said. But what we do know that it was officers responded to a call of disturbance. A man was outside bothering customers. This is one of those situations where not only are we looking at it as a mental health issue, but we're also looking at it as a homeless issue, that people are oftentimes calling the police to try to deal with these issues. And these are not issues that, in our opinion, are issues that officers should be responding to. We know that Benny was diagnosed with mental illness, bipolar schizophrenia. And the unfortunate reality was like what happened very quickly. A lot of you saw the videos. Officers felt like they were left without a choice but to fire at him. And a lot of the community who don't have the same training as police officers look at a situation where there is one man with a knife and several different officers with not only guns, but also less lethal items in terms of stun guns, batons, handcuffs. What could they have done differently to wrangle that knife away from him that would allow Benny Edwards to still be alive today? And then, of course, Savion Rodriguez, a 15-year-old Hispanic male armed with a gun. To our knowledge, we don't know if there was any mental health illness. We don't have a body cam for that one either, or we haven't seen one. And it was undetermined if he was fleeing or not. This was a situation where officers said he failed to comply. And there was 5 officers who shot lethal rounds and one officer who shot a less lethal round, again, making us ask the question and making the community as a whole ask the question, what is the training telling us to do in this situation? But further than that, we have to think about the fact that if Savion is 15 years old, does he understand the gravity of the situation? And the fact that, you know, to our knowledge, he didn't shoot at the officers. To our knowledge, he didn't aim the gun at the officers. He did have the gun, But do we know if a 15-year-old in our society is thinking that officers might shoot and kill him for holding a gun in that situation? We assume as Black Lives Matter that people understand this because this is something that we deal with on a daily basis. But for people who don't come into these interactions, do they believe that the police might use lethal force against them? And on the other end, officers looking at the situation, we want everybody to go home. We want the officers to go home. We want the suspects to go home. But in a situation like this, the officer fearing for their life, like at what age, right, do we try to approach the situation a little bit differently? 15-year-old maybe doesn't know enough about life to understand the gravity of the situation he's in and should definitely be held accountable for his actions. But we have to also think, can he be held accountable for his actions if he is no longer with us? As we move into the final, you had something to say, Sheree?
Yes, I want to interject on one or two things. Earlier, Mr. Higginbotham spoke about the body cams and what other entities and law enforcement agencies were doing. But we did not really touch on how that helped better the relationship and rapport and trust within communities and those law enforcement agencies. When they were bringing in those like mental health professionals that were better able to handle that situation, because that is exactly what they are trained for. They were also able to act as a liaison between the community and law enforcement, which enhanced what we call community policing. Because the officers and those that are part of the law enforcement community were able to know actual community members. So that could have resulted in a very different outcome with that of Mr. Edwards. Many people knew Mr. Edwards, myself included, and knew that he had mental illness. So we are also have been learning to remove the stigma about mental illness. And so people, I hear all the time, they think that police have a negative perception of those that deal with mental illness. Well, when we have trained professionals that are able to come in, that would help diffuse and give officers an opportunity to see how to handle situations differently. If a mental health professional is not available, or if they send in the CIT officers, they have a broader scope of technique to be able to diffuse and de-escalate, and that be the focus. Also, with what Joshua was just saying, in the case of Stavion, I happened to be there that night, and there was a lot of discussion as to how Stavion responded. But are we taking into account that not just a 15-year-old, but anyone in a very tense situation who is not trained to de-escalate knows exactly how to respond, and often it ends in a fatality. And certainly, I believe that the OCPD, as well as our other metropolitan departments, want to decrease those numbers. I would think Oklahoma would want to decrease the numbers ending in fatalities and even injury for everyone statewide. And then lastly, these agencies that have implemented and in a sense have defunded the police to where they reallocated funds to individuals or agencies to go in to handle mental health issues. Also, we kind of have a source to where our DHS workers go in. They're not armed in handling very tense situations with families where minors are involved. And we don't see a result of fatalities because that is not their training, nor is it their goal. It is to remove if necessary, but to also bring a peaceful resolution to whatever is happening in that particular case. We have many family members, and they also advocate for release of the body cam footage. That is another way that helps instill the trust and shows transparency of our law enforcement agencies. And that was one of the things when working with former Chief City and the other, basically the task force around getting the body cams implemented. They said that they wanted to have a different level, a better level of accountability and transparency, and be able to provide that not only to the community, but certainly to families that are continually asking what happened. And so when we've seen systems that have been implemented, it resulted in being able to release that footage sooner. And that also helped relationship between community and the law enforcement agencies and the officers themselves.
As we kind of wrap up here, and I'll toss it back to Josh to make these suggestions, we want to provide suggestions on what we think some of the things that we should be approaching here. But more so than that, we want to think about, in terms of de-escalation training, what we believe de-escalation to be is so much bigger than just the training that police officers receive. It is the efforts that we put together as a city. It's the programs that we implement that keep officers from having to be in situations where they may not be equipped to accurately handle whatever crisis may be created. Bigger than that de-escalation policy of making sure the officers don't have to be there, we have to do an information campaign that teaches the residents of Oklahoma City that it is not illegal to be homeless. It's not illegal to have a mental health issue. And that when you're calling in these situations, that you are very clear about the need for a mental health professional, or the very clear about the need for assistance in housing when you're examining these situations. This is not an issue that we can put on the officers and expect them to be able to fix. This is a culture change that we need for Oklahoma City. And when we talk about use of force, which is one of the other things that we're discussing today, we want you to understand we are not just talking about the firing of a weapon. We're talking about the loss of trust between the community and the police. Because if these situations occur where the person who is a suspect is afraid and the officer is afraid and guns are involved, then more often than needs to be, those guns will be used. So we have to change the culture in terms of use of force, and we have to change the culture in terms of de-escalation to where these are both community efforts, where the police are very intentional on creating transparency around them and providing those checks and balances on themselves, such as the independent monitor, and giving more authority to the Citizens Advisory Board, but also that we are putting in the funds to educate the community to understand that our homeless neighbors are still our friends dealing with mental health issues are still our friends. And we are obligated to make sure that we are doing the absolute most and to the best of our ability, everything we can to save those lives. And I'll let Josh wrap it up.
Right. And so just to sort of reiterate the two big suggestions and the two things that we want to see discussed, and perhaps as 21CP, like we go into developing the subcommittees and things like that, we really want to see policy-wise the push for developing within the confines that we have legally, the independent police monitor that has the ability to actually exist as an independent entity within the city government and have the sort of oversight that would be meaningful and actually provide accountability. And the second thing regarding the de-escalation training, having us think together as a group that maybe the problem isn't we need police to have de-escalation training, but we need the right people to actually respond in the first place. And that maybe the best way to do that is by using some programs that have been modeled and have been tested in other places, like the Cahoots program, and like recently in Denver, the STAR program, so that you actually have mental health workers who are actually responding to mental health crises instead of police officers who, by their very presence, I can say this as someone who has been very close and had family members with mental health issues, they escalate things when they show up. Mental health workers being trained and being unarmed do not, or at least very often that they're much less likely to. And so making sure that they're the ones who are able to respond to those situations is going to make everyone safer and the outcomes for the city much brighter than what they are currently.
Thank you for that. MT, do you want to say anything, or I'll transition to, I see a hand held up. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to recognize that hand's up, and then I had a comment also. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Black Lives Matter for a very good presentation. Thank you for the information that you gave me. It was very, very good information there that I think will lead to some more discussion. Now, Raul, if you'd go ahead.
Sure, and I echo MTM's comments as well to the Joshuas here. But we never mentioned the Latinos. And you talk about escalating an event when you stop a Latino because he looks illegal. And the first question you ask me is, are you from the United States? That alone. So it also includes in the training. I just don't want to leave the second language learners and the profiling of Latinos out of this discussion.
And I agree with that wholeheartedly, Raul.
Yeah, so definitely apologies on my part as I was putting together this. We just got the email about 2 days ago, so we've been doing a lot of research on it, trying to put everything together. And 100%, let us not forget that this is, when we talk about Black and brown people, it's inclusive of so many more folks than just Black people, Hispanic people, Native American people. They all are included in it. But more importantly, for Oklahoma in general, we also, white people as well. We don't want white people shot by police like we don't want Black people shot by police. This isn't an issue of race, though we know it is very disproportionate in terms of those who are oftentimes victims in this situation. This is an issue of us reducing the overall police violence so that we're not second in the nation per capita anymore.
We also want to be mindful that we are also talking about our differently abled and disabled communities, because that has also been an issue. And certainly I do want to amplify and echo what Joshua said, Dr. Font, that we are including all of those of us in melanated skin and in vulnerable communities.
Anisha, are you going to continue the conversation, or were you going in a different area?
Yes, sir. So yes, thank you so very much for that presentation. You all did exactly what I thought you were going to do when I asked you to do this, which is not only bring context from the community, but also, you know, be well researched in the things that you put forward. So I really appreciate that. I do want to move on in the agenda because we will be talking about some of these issues later, but at the same time, I want to offer maybe 5 minutes if there are any questions to clarify. We will have later on in the agenda talking specifically about each one of the subject matters before us, civilian oversight and the de-escalation policy. But is there anything pressing that somebody wants to talk about? And I'll put 5 minutes on the agenda for that. Or
Nisha, I think Sarah, did you have your hand raised from the last thing? I want to make sure. I'm sorry.
Perfect. No, thank you for that.
Just want to thank BLM for that presentation and all the work that they put into that. I also just want to second that we think a lot more like in depth about having healthcare workers or mental health care workers responding to those mental health calls, and having even a separate phone number that they call into for those things. And I also agree that we need a campaign to really educate our community that what they said is absolutely correct. It is not illegal to have a mental health crisis, and it is not illegal to be homeless. And so those things should not be, that is a community awareness piece that I think is equally important as well. So thank you, BLM, for that presentation. It was great.
I see two hands. I think Dexter's hand was up, and then Councilman Cooper's hand was up.
Yeah, I'm not going to take much time. I just wanted to say I'll have to bug out here in a little bit, but I just wanted Black Lives Matters and the other representatives here to know that, from the law enforcement community, we welcome what you're talking about. We would love to have someone else respond to all the calls we respond to. So I'm familiar with some of the models you're talking about. I would love to make myself available to you to help clarify some of the things that you said that you need some clarification on as it relates to law enforcement. So I'll make myself available to you all later on. If you want to reach out to me, I'll help work with you to help you work anything you want to work. But I'm not going to go too long with the questions. I got a list of them because I got to go here in a little bit. I just want to make myself available to you all. I'll give my number to MT if you want to reach out. I'll help you in any way I can.
And the only thing I would say, Dexter, if you don't mind, we sent out a survey asking which subcommittee you might want to be on, and that might help by you choosing one of those subcommittees so that everybody can benefit from your experience in law enforcement.
Already
current.
Okay.
Okay.
Anisha, I have a hand up by James Cooper.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. I am delivering groceries to my mother out in Midwest City, so that's why you can't see the video right now. Safety first. So I also want to echo the sentiments in terms of saying thank you to BLM for their presentation. And I think one thing I am, very interested in, I just mentioned this to Major Balderrama earlier today, who's our new major over in Spring Lake Division, as many of you know. His twin brother sent me a video about a year ago after we passed the community policing resolution. He sent a video that I would encourage everybody to Google for yourself that references the pilot program Denver is undertaking right now, having those mental health officers respond when it's a mental health crisis. So I'd really encourage everyone to do a Google search. The Today Show did a video on it. And again, that was from one of our former deputy chiefs sending that video to me. And I will never forget that moment when he did, because it showed me that what our resolution is asking for, and that is, I believe, Initiative 4, the alternative response for mental health. That showed me that we're not in the realm of the abstract with that request, and that's very important. And I think we're going to have to do, to Sarah's point, and I think maybe it was Sheree who said this. No, it was Josh. The educational part of this is going to be so important, making sure people understand what it exactly is that we're asking for. Okay, so that's one thing. The next thing is I would really encourage our 21CP friends, and it didn't click until about a week ago that this was something to recommend, but the city council meetings from June 2nd, the city council meetings from June 9th, the city council meeting from June 16th. I would highly recommend that you all watch that. I would recommend anyone on this call who did not participate in those virtual meetings last year. Lengthy meetings, but they're worth your time, because it's going to give some more context to what we heard from BLM today regarding residents who, one after another, called in last June 2nd, June 9th, and June 16th to share their experiences, good and bad, with law enforcement and their policy prescriptions. And it's clicked in my head that that might be something very, very useful, again, for our 21CP friends to hear as part of the community outreach, because so many people outreached to us. And those items that we put forth in that resolution are the result of listening to those residents. And those are all available on the city's YouTube page under videos. Again, June 2nd, June 9th, and then the final vote on June 16th, where we approve the resolution. So that's something else I would note. And then finally, and this is, I guess, maybe more of a question for 21CP. What sort of timeline are we looking at in terms of you all being able to offer some conclusions from your research? Because specifically, just sticking with the mental health alternative, that was the goal, was to have you all be able to go out there and look at the different cities, quite frankly, globally, to see who's doing these sorts of programs, who's doing them the best, what are some of the pitfalls they've encountered, so that what we put forth to City Council in terms of these recommendations, that we can kind of offer a gold standard. And I've been very concerned in recent months that our resolution called for that research to find itself in front of council in time for this year's budget, this May and June. And let's just say I'm very concerned that whether or not we're going to be able to meet that deadline. And I feel a very strong sense of first references again to Savion and to Benny. And that was in December. So there are people like Benny who call our city home, that I want to do everything I can to make sure that they go home safely and that our officers return home safely as well. So what kind of timeline are we looking at?
So thank you for your comments and your questions. So we're going along with the timeline that was provided in the RFP contract. And so according to that, there is conversation and communication with this working group, the oversight group, and the task force until June. And so the next part of the agenda, which I won't go into deeply until we get these other hands that are up, is going to talk about the subcommittees and how we want to break this up and start talking about best practices and marrying those best practices with the situation on the ground in Oklahoma, to make sure that, as they said during the BLM presentation, you can have best practices, but you also would have to make sure that those things line up with the expectations of your own community, your diverse community. So that's the timeline we're following until, someone says something different. Now, if something comes out of those, subcommittee groups and somebody wants to act on it right away, that's certainly the purview of the city. But as you recount some of these issues with the mental health alternative response to mental health, need to be very thoughtful, and you need to have the right people show up. And I don't just mean police. I also mean that, there are social workers, there are other workers that cause trauma and issues in our communities as well. So we want to make sure that those people are up to speed and up to task. So hopefully that answered your question, but we will go into a little bit more detail about how we plan to work on that next. I see Dr. Thompson's hand up, and I think there was one more, but if we want to.
Tim Tornabono had his hand up also.
Okay.
I'm not sure who's she recognizing, Tim or me.
Go ahead, Valerie.
You can go, Dr.
Okay. Thank you. Just real briefly, I appreciate the presentation today. Thank you for the information. And I also appreciate the information that Councilman Cooper was providing. I think the resources from the council meeting would be an excellent resource for 21CP to go back and look at. But I also want to suggest, if 21CP has not already done this, and I appreciate my colleague Raul Font with the Latino Development Agency making his statements as well. I want to suggest that there are over 60 plus United Way partner agency, and MT Berry, you know this as well, that could help in this area, particularly in mental health. Homeless Alliance is a great resource. There are several different agencies that are experts when it comes to some of the things that Black Lives Matter was suggesting that we need to look at. And I want to remind everyone that we did hire consultants, 21CP, to give us the best recommendation. But I don't want us to overlook that there are countless United Way Partners agencies that have years of experience dealing with these type of issues, and hope that they would also reach out to them as a resource.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And I don't have my notes here. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there were additional consultants that were hired to look at this issue in particular. Additionally, I think that there might be a task force that is set up around these issues as well. So we got to make sure that we are including all of those resources. But certainly the United Way is a wonderful example of across a lot of different resources there. And then I'll take the last question or comment, Tim.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to the BLM folks. I think that's exactly the kind of information, especially on these alternative response ideas. And I can't remember which Joshua mentioned it, and this might be too much in the weeds at this point, but I'm curious, was the funding for both in Denver and Oregon, did that come through the police department? Or, Dr. Thompson mentioned, I'm trying to think through already, I'm thinking budgetary impact, sorry to get ahead that fast, but is it a contract with some of these United Way partners that are experts in the mental health field? Just what are the mechanics of monetarily, how did that money get moved into these programs?
So I can tell you for sure that in, I think it's Eugene, Oregon, if I'm not mistaken, when they got that program started, so the way that they figured it out, they did in fact fund it with money, at least initially. I think the majority of it came from within the police department. And they worked very closely with them, but because what they found was that we're still talking about a pretty small unit, right, that travels around and responds to a lot of these calls. But what they found was that fully funding healthcare workers was cheaper at the end of the day than having police officers responding to absolutely everything. So it's not even, because you don't want to get in that weird situation where it's like, well, we're not going to spend adequately, we'll just send these people. But like, it actually was cost effective. It was sort of one of those rare instances where, and in fact, they have it graphed out, I think, on the website. I'll find it and send it along in an email to everybody, but where like year after year, they actually were saving more and more as the program grew and expanded, because it meant that you weren't sending officers out, which meant, of course, less overtime, less, and so it actually did help budgetarily with everything. And I'm pretty sure there was also, I could be wrong, but I think there was a smaller federal grant involved at some point after the first few years. And I know that the two programs are different because, Cahoots started, it's my understanding, they first kind of piloted that in 1989, and it was very much grassroots and came from the community, which is one thing I also want to reiterate here, just to kind of throw back in. It's very easy for some of these other mental health systems and other things can be somewhat police-like and carceral very often. And it's very important to have people from communities actually taking care of communities, right? As opposed to, coming from the outside always. So I think that one of the reasons why the Cahoots program worked, or at least is working, is because it is grounded and grassroots, and really came from people that were already a part of the community.
Yeah.
I think just to add to that really briefly, you know, when we talk about the unfortunate reality that we oftentimes are in situations where we don't have enough recruits for the police departments, and that there's a growing lack of ability to bring in more officers. What we have here is a situation where we can kind of make sure that we're supplementing the fact that we don't have enough officers with the fact that officers shouldn't be taking all of these calls. So as we bring in these folks, who we will see that it's actually saving the police overall money, because they're not being kind of stretched as thin, and they're actually handling situations that they're supposed to be handling, can spend more time making the investigations that they're working on, get the attention that they need. And we have this entire other group, which it looks like we might be creating a new expense, but we'll actually be reducing that expense, as shown through the research that we've been working on. We do have a presentation. I told Sharita that I'll be sending it over to her so that we can send it out to you all, so that you can see not just the presentation aspect of it. I apologize for not putting it up. Not just the presentation aspect of it, but the accompanying documents that we have as well. So all of the research that we're talking about, all of that is included. And I don't know if Venetia, they gave you the first presentation we did and the research that we had involved in that one, but if not, I can make sure that you get that as well.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's great. So that it can be a repository, not only for us, but also for the subcommittees that can refer back. Because, you know, because these issues are so important, and, you know, to you guys' point, there is, you know, differing information and studies. You know, we really want folks to be able to dig down into, again, what really has worked before and what is going to work in your communities. I mean, the other thing that's really important that we have to make sure to lift up is that we have cultural differences, you know, in and the way even people look at mental health, privacy, all sorts of things. So hopefully we can delve into those things as we get into the subcommittee. So I'm going to transition into that. I'm going to, oh yes, ma'am. Andrea,
please pardon the interruption. Garland wants to speak, but he's having some technical difficulties. He is listening through my speakerphone on my cell phone. So I don't know if I can make this work or not, but he really wants to speak, and I'm trying to make this possible, but if it doesn't work, I understand, and he does as well. So Garland.
If I hear you right now and I hear them, I should be able to just, however you need to open it up.
Well, yes, sir. We hear you, and I also want to just acknowledge this wonderful document you sent us. I mean, it's amazing. 8 pages of just list of things that we need to go to and get after. So I appreciate that, but the floor is yours, sir.
Yes, okay, now, what my major concern is when we look at those numbers that were put forth, the 27, the 19, the 7, when we look at, you say, RNC will be over in June, that's less than 4 months. What can we implement? What can we put in place? What can we do even before that particular is over? Now, the police department themselves say, we got 8 that can't wait. What's the problem in implementing those? The list that we actually ended up providing you with had everything to do with things that are being practiced across the country already. And so I'm looking at, if we are those that are in charge, we are those with titles and positions and in a position to fix, change, and correct, if we are those that can implement things, who do we have to ask or who do we have to wait on in order to do some of these things versus talk about them? Mental health, I applaud them for what they did, especially when you end up with a 41% of mental health issues. That's half everything they do. So we promote it, support it, endorse it, and recommend it. And as soon as we can implement anything moving forward, that's the whole concept of why we came together to begin with. We don't want to be number 2. And yes, so the only way we're going to do that is to implement some of these things that are being brought forth. Mental health, 100%. I loved it. And like I say, if 40%, if half of the calls and the killings that are taking place are mental health issues, it's a major, major, major. And beyond that, let's try to implement something, let's put something in place, and we can talk till the cows go home, and we don't have no cows. So let's try to do something as we move forward to fix, change, and correct where we at. I know we can. We got the people in here, the ones on here on the line right now, and those that are not on the line right now. We can make this thing happen. I want to see, what did it say? I don't want to hear about the pregnancy. I want to see the baby.
Okay.
Anisha,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
just real quickly, thank you, Garland, for your input there. And I received information from the chief of police that they have implemented all 8 of the 8 can't wait recommendations.
Thank you. That's a start. Now,
Okay.
another list I gave you with the 90 on it.
Yes, this is a mighty, mighty list. Let me tell you what. So let me say this, and what we could possibly do is in our next meeting, facilitate, or maybe even in between the time, facilitate a conversation because, Garland, you have made it clear from the first moment I met you that things should have been done a long time ago, and I agree with you. But there's also people on this call who do not trust certain people to make decisions for them and their communities. And I think part of the reason why we're gathering is for that checks and balance. So what I can commit to you is that we can go back to 21 CP, talk with the city and see if there is not a way to bifurcate this to a certain degree and say, here's some things that we could possibly do now and have a conversation about it. And then here's the things that people absolutely want to have themselves weigh in on and feel like there's several communities that never get talked to or asked about in these type of situations. And so they may want those folks' voices, as a part of this conversation so that they don't feel like people made decisions for them. So I think we can find a balance because I definitely hear what you're saying.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And so the next item that I'm going to move to is something that you all, in a cursory manner last time agreed to. And thank you, Andrea, for that. Getting him on the call. I appreciate that.
No problem.
That we had a cursory, kind of little vote there that people agreed that we should break this down into subcommittees. And so I'm going to put before you my suggestions on a way to do that. I certainly don't think y'all will be shy and let me know what you like or don't like or any changes that you might want to look at. So the first thing is we have 2 subject matters that are before this group. Both the de-escalation policy, which BLM, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, has established that is very narrow. There is so many other things that can fall underneath de-escalation policy. And then also what I'm going to shorten is to civilian oversight. And so the idea is to break us into 2 different subcommittees. We should have a 21 CP chair. We should also have a task force chair. The idea there is that the 21 CP person is going to be responsible for what you all have called for, the best practices, the ideas from around the country. And then the task force co-chair will be there to add context, to keep us in check, and those sorts of things, but they will work in concert in order to bring forward some recommendations. The second part is that this will require, we believe, meetings in between the monthly meetings, because as Garland pointed out, we have 4 months, which is not a lot of time, quite frankly. And so, to try to make the most of people's time, for us to meet in between these subcommittees. The next one is, I would suggest a format similar to what we had today. We have a presentation either by a community group or by a person, somebody from Cahoots, somebody from the STAR program, whatever it is that you all feel like you need, somebody to present on the actual training or policy or whatever that's going on at the police department now. And then the second part is to then break that 22-person group, if everybody showed up, into smaller working groups on the call so that you can talk amongst yourself. I will provide a template you don't have to go by it. You can go wherever you want to, but just to create consistency across the subcommittees, we would have you fill those things out and then report. We'll take a portion of our monthly calls and report on what has come out of the subcommittee meetings. Next, we would encourage you to try to have your first meeting this month and decide what dates were best for you so that those can be on the calendar and people can talk about what's most convenient for them. We will assist you with the Zoom, so that you can have that as a resource. The last part of this, and then we could get into it later with the community engagement, but we're looking at large virtual town halls, perhaps one and adding a youth subcommittee. That's completely brand new, but I think that it should be youth initiated and youth led and supported by us. So those are the ideas I'm putting forward to you as far as the subcommittees. If there is disagreement, if you'll speak up and let me know about that, and we can talk about it. Otherwise, I will assume that you agree with this, and then we will go back and put something out that you can go back and actually refer to instead of trying to just remember everything that I just said. I thought we were going to have a chat, so I was going to throw all that in the chat, but we don't have one, so we can circle back around by email. Are there any questions or concerns about that process? I'm gonna go to my other screen and see if I see any hands. Okay, perfect. Okay, good. All right, so we will get to working on all of those things that I put before you. And do I have any volunteers to help with the youth subcommittee, at least identifying the young people that we should talk to initially and get that going? Okay, I see Mr. Cooper. I see, and Jessica, you're taking these down, I think. I see Mr. Cooper, I see Mr. Cox, I see Mr. Harris Till, I see Reverend Sherry. I see Gloria Torres. I see Kendra Wilson Clements. I see Ron Basie. Okay. And you can always, circle back around. Is my principal on here? We had a principal. Is he on here? Okay, well.
Yes, ma'am. That's me, Mr. Cox.
Perfect. Okay, awesome. Yeah, I was looking for you. Okay. So we will send you all a separate. Oh yeah, go ahead, Jessica.
You have Mr. Cooper's hand up, Ganesha.
Yeah, I thought
maybe he just left it up.
Yeah.
Councilman Cooper, if your hand is raised and you need to speak, please feel free to unmic. Otherwise, we'll just know that it was left over.
It was left over. Thank you.
Yes, because I trust he was doing that at a stoplight and he just had to start driving and forgot to put it down. All right, so we've got that. We will send you a separate email so that we can have a conversation about the best way. Again, like I said, I think it should be youth led and we just provide the provision for them. Okay, so the next thing that I'm going to move to in the agenda.
Hey, Ganesha.
Yes, sir.
This is Craig. Sorry. I want to apologize. I want to just interject as you're doing that transition real quick. I should have done this at the first of the meeting, but Deputy Chief Ron Basie, and you just mentioned his name. Chief Basie, is your camera? Oh, there he is right there. Okay. I just wanted to introduce him. He's our newest Deputy Police Chief, and he is replacing Paco on the task force. I should have introduced him at the very beginning, and I apologize for that. Really thankful to have him here. Has a long history with the police department, does great work for us, and we're really excited to have him in his new role and excited to have him as a part of the task force. So I apologize for not introducing him to begin with.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you. Did somebody say something?
Yeah, I was just going to say to Craig, is it possible that we could ask Beto to come on and serve on this committee as well? I know that he's would be really important to that conversation
Yeah,
as well.
that's something we can discuss. We got, because Ron is coming on to replace Paco, that he was on as deputy chief. Actually, Ron is on the working group too. We may look at maybe having Beto plug in on that with his role there. So we'll have some discussion about that, and I'll circle back with you.
Thank you.
Okay, so to frame this conversation, and Jessica may take notes so that everybody can kind of see what's going on. But to give you some context for this conversation, before we break into our working groups, and we are not going to hit everything today, I just want to get your minds moving. And BLM's presentation kind of leaned into this as well. There is a lot underneath, first of all, these two issues before you, and there is crossover, right? Because under de-escalation, you want to talk about CIT, our response to people in mental and behavioral health crisis, but technically, that actual line item is, under the working group. And so we want to make sure first of all, I want to frame the conversation and tell you, just throw out some things that could possibly be under de-escalation. And then what I want to do is then pause and have folks on the calls say things that you believe fall under de-escalation, that you want to be covered in some of these subcommittee conversations. And so I'm going to start, and it's going to be a bit of a list, but this is just to give you an idea of how wide this can be. So,
Sharita, could you help me share screen so that what Ganesh is about to present, I can show everyone? Thank you.
Perfect. So just under de-escalation policy, you have use of force, overall, and in some places you have use of force broken up to 3 categories. I think somebody brought it up the other day. In some places, just showing your firearm is a use of force. So there's all those different uses of force. Taser. You have less lethal. You guys have talked about your issues with protest. So how do you use force at protest? Early intervention system, the body worn camera. We've talked about that a lot. A duty to intervene. We talked about chokeholds, policy, training, whistleblower protections for those who do actually intervene and report misconduct. Community outreach and education around use of force. Complaints, citizen complaints, things that have come up across the country as big issues, shooting at cars, shooting from moving cars. In some places, the K-9 unit is considered an issue with use of force. You also have the data collection, the internal review board. So not one that's done from civilians, but one that's done inside of a police department. And the Police Executive Research Forum sometimes say what's lawful under the law, but awful. And so that person may not be criminally charged, but you still may want to change some policies or training along with that because it's an issue for the police and the community that they're supposed to be serving. Investigations of use of force. We've talked about police-involved shootings, the discipline that accompanies use of force, bias-free policing and stops, searches, arrest. And one that, I added, but was really important that I brought training to Baltimore City about, which was how do we respond to youth? Because we know that they are not cognitively, they are not developed the same way in their bodies. You have a 6'5", 14-year-old child, the body may look like an adult, but the mind has not developed to that stage. And then also there are studies that have shown that our young people who deal with a lot of trauma respond completely differently to command and control. If you're yelling at them, you put them in a certain stance that could automatically escalate the situation. So I threw all that out there. It's up here on the screen. That's a list in no particular order, but the idea there is to say, are there other things beyond de-escalation policy that you all want to make sure that are covered in the subcommittees? And I can't see your face with the screen up. So if MT, if you see anybody's hand go up, if you don't mind calling them on them, and feel free to just shout it out, or if you have questions based upon what I just went over.
Can you explain what OIS and CIT is? The acronyms are not, that does not equate for me.
Yes, I'm sorry. So officer involved shooting response. So that can be a myriad of things, but after a police involved shooting, you have people, you have the disciplinary issues that's going to happen. You have who's going to respond to the scene and do the investigation. I wonder in Oklahoma City, because you have, probably different, you might have tribal police. There can sometimes be, issues with jurisdiction. So there's a lot of issues there for officer involved shootings. And we've also already talked about that you all are unhappy with, the reporting of you all being number 2. And then the other one that you ask about, EIS, that's early intervention system. And so that basically refers to generally a system where there's an algorithm where police officers, a flag is brought up on their on a system. So let's say, you set it to say that an officer cannot have more than 3 citizen complaints within a month. And then as soon as they get 4, a flag comes up, and generally you have some sort of intervention, whether that's counseling, whether that's retraining, whether that's, a myriad of different things. But the idea is that it's completely non-disciplinary. And what you're trying to do is catch officers early in some issues so that you can intervene and try to help that officer before it comes to something where they're disciplined for.
Thank you. One thing that I would say, I don't know if it's somewhere else on here, but the having police in schools or armed police in schools is something else that I think is important to mention.
Okay, SROs.
I have a hand up, Kanisha, from Ed Koninsky.
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Along the same lines as your crisis intervention would be your crisis debriefing.
Absolutely. Yes, for the police officers.
Yes.
Yes, sir. Absolutely.
Officers and the situation as well.
Yes, yes, yes. That's definitely a huge issue with our officer wellness. So we'll make to identify that as crossover.
Joshua Harris Teal.
I have a list, but I can't find it right now. Is it okay? Like, are we getting sent this? Can we send it back? Is this something that needs to happen right now?
Yeah, so what I think we'll do is we're gonna take these notes and provide them to the subcommittee so that they have this for reference as they move into their conversations around the de-escalation policy. So yes, feel free to send them to us and we'll make sure that it's available to those folks. Thank you.
James Cooper.
Yes, a resident brought to my attention as we were discussing the resolution about a month or 2 ago. She was the neighborhood president in a neighborhood where we saw a toddler killed in a drive-by a year ago around Christmas. And this particular resident mentioned to me, and I feel like it could go under de-escalation here, but that what about for a neighborhood when they experience either a homicide or from resident to resident, or if there is an officer involved shooting, what about trauma services for the folk in that area? That was something a resident brought to my attention, and I think that's a really important thing for us to consider, because as you just mentioned, how kids respond to trauma, and when you said that, it brought this back to my attention, especially because, as you know, this state literally has, if not the highest, some of the highest adverse childhood experience scores. And when those instances of violence occur in a neighborhood, then whether again, resident to resident, or it's an officer involved one, that's another trauma. And what's been going on is that these traumas are compounding on each other, right? And so I think that could be part of a de-escalation conversation, because the less trauma one is, the more access to some sort of care regarding that trauma will likely interrupt that cycle of violence. Hurt people. And if we can intervene at that level, I think that would be something I would throw in for consideration here.
Okay.
And then, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
And then I know this is a working group conversation, but I think I really appreciate the way BLM reframed all of this today, because I had not necessarily considered those items on the resolution in terms of de-escalation. I was thinking more of just public safety and community policing, but now I see that. I see how the homelessness initiative or the alternative to mental health care. But I think one I'm really interested in us looking at here too, in this group, as well as what they're doing in the working group, is I would like conversations around those violence interruption programs, particularly after watching the Frontline documentary that just came out recently, the Policing the Police 2020. They're in Newark, and I got to see for myself what an actual violence interruption program looks like. And I think their homicide rates dropped like dramatically. And I'd love that for our city here. So I'd like at least some spillover here in terms of conversations about violence interruption programs, because I think that is also a de-escalation thing in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. The two things that you mentioned was the first time I've heard them under de-escalation, but I automatically put them with the line item of creation of a neighborhood safety / violence interruption program. So I think that we can have them in both areas.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
Anisha, I have Grace Franklin next.
Yes, ma'am.
Hello. You want to see me? I apologize. I'm driving in the street. I have a concern about, and I just want people to keep this. I don't know how we need to do this, but when we're talking about cross subjects, those things that we're talking about with other task groups, task force, we have this task force, we have the working policing group. There is also a Human Rights Commission task force. There is also a homeless task force that's working right now that will be covering some of these issues as well. I don't know how we can do it if we are going to mark certain things that are like where you were talking about cross subjects. But I think it's important that we understand who's doing what and how all of that's going to work together, because it may be a situation where some task force have a little more ability and move quicker than others. And maybe we need to be communicating better about what we're suggesting, or maybe not. Maybe they are in cyclical form and we come up with different ideas. I don't know, but I think we need to keep in mind that there are at least 4 other groups working right now on many of these same issues. I don't know how we do that when we're trying to break down the subcommittees, but keep that in mind if that makes sense.
I think that's a great point, and what I'm going to put out there, and I reserve the right to disagree with myself in the future, but that maybe Kenton, if we couldn't get a list of all the task forces that are working in the city right now, along with their charter, and then maybe we can come up with some sort of matrix with their timeline, because maybe they're working year round, and there are some things that we need to do right now, but maybe a matrix where we can have some spillover, whether that's the consultants that are working on some of these issues, check in with them, check in with the task force to see where they are. They may want some information from the subcommittees to come over to the work that they're doing. But Grace, we'll commit to you to meet with the city and talk about this and try to come up with some way to deconflict and share information.
Yeah, and Ganesha, and for Grace, I've already sent them, for example, I know you're on the community policing working group. I've already given 21 CP. We've started opening those lines of communication with the homelessness task force folks and with the officer wellness consultant that we had, because those are two of our topics on the community policing working group. But we'll certainly get that, Ganesha, for those other groups that you mentioned as well.
Perfect. Thank you.
Ganesha, next I have Joanne Davis.
Good afternoon. Let me put my camera on here. You know, as we talk about areas, and Councilman Cooper has brought up the neighborhoods, I want to bring up the small businesses and the businesses because two of the last incidences that I'm aware of happened in front of businesses. And so I don't think we a lot of times focus on our businesses where these incidences do happen and the after effect. Their employees, their current customers, their future customers, and whether or not their profitability or their sales go down as a result of these incidences. And with COVID and many of our businesses closing, this could be just an added can of gas to their survival. So I'd like to see us at least try to take a look at that, because that's important, because they are part of what makes our economy run in this city. So that's just something.
That's absolutely true. Not only from the
that I thought about as we're discussing.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, thank you. I think that's important, not only from a business standpoint, as you mentioned, but also the trauma just from the employees, that are there. And so in some cities, there are trauma-informed care initiatives. Are there any of those in Oklahoma City right now? Okay, Jessica, if you'll just make a note for trauma-informed care, because, or trauma-informed period, because that may be a way for us to overlay these on a couple of different issues.
The next hand up I have is Joshua Higginbotham.
Yeah, so I don't know if this would fall, I kind of feel like it falls under both of the areas, but I actually have a list of questions that deal with, I guess, what you would call the militarization of police and the way in which that has affected the budget. And I kind of wonder, are there areas in trying to figure out how to pay for some of these alternatives and things, are there, are there ways of looking at, the various weapons and trainings and other things like that, we could kind of like examine and say, this might not fit into the scope of what we're wanting to do with de-escalation. And maybe some of the resources that have gone toward that could be allocated toward CIT training or, something along those lines. And I don't really know, is that something that could fall under de-escalation, or should that be a separate?
I think it's worth giving it to the subcommittees to talk about, because if you think about Ferguson, I mean, you have a lot of people who said they wouldn't have rolled out there in tanks and looking like, it was time for war, then it might not have escalated. So I've not seen that traditionally included, but I think it's something worth for the subcommittees to take up and talk about as it relates to Oklahoma City, definitely.
Okay.
Yep. So I'm going to wrap this one up. Oh, go ahead. Is there more?
Well, I have Carrie.
This is the interpreter for Rachel Hollis. Another thing that she wanted to mention was involving language and cultural specialists. Maybe that could help with de-escalation situations.
Absolutely, absolutely. We know that there are many issues where people are assumed to be non-compliant and not following police commands. And so that is a huge piece of this. So thank you so very much for bringing that up.
And lastly, Josh Teal, Your hand is up, but is that a hangover or did you? Okay, very good. Back to you, Venetia.
Okay, perfect. I wanted to spend some time on community outreach on this particular issue, but I think I'm going to save community outreach for the last 15 minutes for us to talk about as a group, and move to the next subject matter here, which is civilian oversight. And as was mentioned, civilian oversight takes a lot of forms. You can have a civilian review board. You can have the IG concept that was talked about earlier with BLM. You can have, as we've seen in consent decrees, monitors that are hired to judge compliance. And so one of the things that I wanted to put out here was just to make sure that we're hearing from you all on any different forms, formats, or areas that you think are important for consideration for independent accountability to the community. So I have listed officer misconduct and accountability. That's internal and can be with a civilian review board. I have civilian review board. We have the inspector general. We have transparency and access to information. I think that has come up several times with the body worn camera, and there's probably other issues. And then we have the independent monitoring mentioned as well. Is there any other things that you all want the subcommittee to take up as it relates to law enforcement or independent accountability to the community?
I would just add that whenever we're talking about these, information that's released to the public or to the community, that we talk about deadlines for that, like how often are we going to be getting those, and accountability to those deadlines to make sure that it's not like once a year or something like that.
I think that's really important. I'll bring this up just for brainstorming purposes. Some police departments put out use of force, once a month. Some of them put it out, on a regular basis. Others just put it out in an annual report. So thank you for bringing that up. And that's definitely something the subcommittee should take up. I think I see Reverend Sherry's hand up.
Yes, I'm not exactly sure where this would go, but I've had several community members want a conversation or this to be part of the conversation, and that is public perception or what they witness when they see police interactions when they're not necessarily involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I will give an example. I get a lot of calls when people actually are driving or just are in neighborhoods and they see police presence. And many of them feel like certain areas, especially Northeast Oklahoma City, we deal with over-policing or a preponderance of presence. And the attitude of the officers, many feel is just inappropriate. I have some videos, a lot of people, and we're in a day and age where I think officers need to be aware that they're, even with their body cams, that everyone or many people have the ability to also document and record what is happening. And most are doing that for transparency and to be able to have validation of their concerns. And so the seeming aloofness or sometimes the indignation that are shown by some of the officers, it breaks down the trust very quickly. I had a woman who talked about seeing a person who had been apprehended was naked. And this was recently, it was cold. And a few community members were just saying, can we offer him cover.
Mm.
And many of the officers were just kind of laughing. Well, we don't know what they were laughing about, but when you are doing your job, working as a public servant, and people see you standing in a situation to where someone's dignity is not held in the regard that it should be, you laughing and maybe showing jovial antics certainly could be considered, it could be misinterpreted. And if it is what you're doing, so many community members want that to be part of the conversation.
Okay. I definitely hear that. And I'm going to throw out two maybe starting points for a conversation. One, and it's been my experience that most of the time communities do not know actually what police officers can be held accountable for. So, you know, there are, you know, charges for rudeness, for, behavior that's unbecoming, not upholding certain values. So I think one of the things is for the committee to actually see those things and know what the expectations are of the police department for the people, the officers in the community, number one. And then number two, to look at the complaint system such that if the community is, educated on what the officer is supposed to do, then what is the recourse, for that. And then, maybe we can have, some conversation around what the police department would want to do or like to do as it relates to responding to that, depending on the degree of, the behavior, whether it was rudeness or if it was just egregious, quite frankly. So does that capture that a little bit if people start with that conversation?
I feel it certainly would. That was exactly what I was speaking of. So thank you.
Perfect. Okay. Thanks.
Framing that correctly.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. All right. So are there any more hands before I move? Yes, sir. I see your hand up, but I can't. Oh, there it is. Gary Woods.
Yeah. Thank you for adding to the comments that Reverend Cherie was sharing with us, because as I was sitting here looking at independent accountability to the community, I can't help but to wonder, what is allowed and what isn't allowed from a policy or contractual standpoint. And then in addition to that, knowing how to navigate the system, which is a major piece that, quite honestly, I don't understand all the ins and outs, and I don't think anyone except for those who are actually, currently serving as officers, or maybe our city manager and of course MT would know how to even what is even possible in terms of accountability, as it relates to the community. And so I think more insight, more education there will be needed, because I wouldn't even know where to start, to be totally honest, other than just simply filing a complaint, and then and how to see it through, right? How to follow through with it to ensure that it gets traction, and that the proper attention is paid to each incident as they occur.
Yeah, and thank you for that. And to your point, what has happened with me over the years is, as being a civilian, but then working in the police department, I'm like, oh, okay, I can see that, and maybe I can translate. And one of the things that I did, and I'll put this out for your input, is, I created a IA community response group. So, you have patrol that's out there talking about, about crimes and things like that at the district level. But we had an education portion for those who worked in IA to come out to community meetings as requested, to kind of walk people through those processes. So that may be something that the subcommittee can take up and look at as well.
Can we also add that many of the community members talk about a fear of making reports and providing documentation, what they see for because of fear of retaliation and being targeted, them or their families. That's a number one thing. That's, I didn't say anything because I don't want to start to, and I can relate. I get pulled over a lot and just nothing happens. But the intimidation is it's a factor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We hear about that a lot. Okay. We will definitely should take that up. Is there anything else? I'm going to circle in our last 12 minutes. I should probably leave some time for MT to wrap us up with anything he needs, but I'm going to move to our community.
Ganesha, you have Garland Pruitt raising his hand. I don't know if we still need to do the talk through system, but I just wanted to note that.
Okay, I'm sorry. I think you said something, Mr.
Ms. Bryce.
Please go ahead.
Can't hear you, Garland.
Go ahead, just speak.
Yes. When you was making mention of de-escalation, now I'm looking at it from a different perspective other than just the police officers de-escalating, but as far as them providing us with information. In other words, the preliminary investigation is over. The DA has received the information. He's acted on that information. How soon can we put something in place that we can be provided with that information so we can calm some of these folks down that's calling us and checking us?
Yep.
The investigation has been over.
Yep.
It should be public record, but we're still not able to receive the information. So that's another form of de-escalation for us to be able to deal with the general public when we're contacted concerning what's the issue, what's the outcome. How soon can we provide a report, video camera, and everything else that pertaining to the case?
Yes, sir.
Because of it is not everything has been completed as far as that's what we're hearing through the media and through the news.
Yes, sir. Okay, we got that, and that's definitely important. Communicating early and often. We definitely have that, and that needs to be taken up. Okay, the last thing that I'm going to transition to really quickly, and I'm going to read from the contract so that we are all on the same page, and so the folks understand kind of where I'm coming from on this conversation. So in the contract, it says, identify with the assistance of city staff, the task force, working group, all community groups necessary to meet and confer with, to learn and review current community and law enforcement conditions. The city's internal review committee will provide names and contact information for group contacts. These contacts will be provided as a resource of effective outreach to the 21 CP discussions. But the 21 CP discussions are in no way limited to only those contacts. So I wanted us to have that as a baseline. And then the next thing I want to do is we sent you all a survey. In that survey, we asked if you wanted to hold community listening sessions. Is there anybody who either did not receive that or have any questions about that? So the idea here is around community engagement is a couple of things. First of all, these meetings that we're having with folks internally, the task force working group. The next thing, there are folks on the task force that I've reached out to talk to because they represent organizations, in the city that we might want to have conversations with. Additionally, in this survey here, we have asked, do you want to be part of hosting a virtual listening session with your constituency? If you do, then we ask for you to respond in this document. The other thing that I mentioned are town halls that will not be curated. They will just be open. We hope to have about a month time to advertise those so people can be aware of those. And then the last piece of it, actually two more pieces. One is a survey that needs to be conducted we want somebody local to Oklahoma City community So we might not have time to talk about that. So we might have to send an email out about it. And then the last piece is the folks whose voices get left out of this conversation because they don't have technology, because they're working 2 and 3 jobs, because they don't have a job, because they are recently homeless. And so we need to come up with some ways to make sure to reach those folks. And so while we have some ideas, we want to solicit some from you as well, because you know your community. And we also want to know for people who want to hand us, information and say, go forth 21CP and you do this, or these are my people. And I will work with you in order to bring those folks to the table, or for us to go to them in some form or fashion. So I see a hand up for Dr. Thompson. I'll pause for that for you to ask any questions, and then anybody else. The main goal that I'm trying to do in these last rushed few minutes is if there are people that you think that we should be reaching out to. I wanted you all to be able to put it in the chat, but otherwise, if you can just shout it out, or since we've run out of time, we may just send you an email to do this as well.
Kanisha, before you go to Dr. Thompson, just let me say that if there's business that you would like to conduct and we have task force members who will stay on board and do that, then we will go until you've got your answers.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Ms. Thompson.
Yes, thank you. I'll be brief because I know the hour is late. I just want to say I did receive the information about the survey, but I did not complete it because I had several questions about how the information was requested. And for the Urban League, we've been in the community almost 75 years. And so our reach is wide and deep, and didn't know quite how we can make a significant impact. So I'm going to go back, work with my team on some of the questions, but I was wondering who's the contact person that I can visit with to make sure we can adequately be of assistance to you and your team as it relates to this. And yes, we probably will want to do a listening session. And I'm sure Raul with Latino Community Development Agency is having similar questions as well. So is there someone that we need to contact to get further information so we can be specific on how we answer your survey?
Yes, ma'am. So if Dr. Thompson, if you look in your email, you probably have an email from me in which I mentioned that I would like to talk to you directly because of your reach and because of your programmatic. And it was just sent out yesterday or today, so you might not have seen it, quite frankly. But because of your reach in the community, we feel like we need to have probably a closer conversation with you about what's best for a listening session, what's best for a small session. But I will be the contact for that. So feel free to reach out to me. And I wrote down Raul's name right away at the beginning of the meeting and saying I need to reach out to him right away as well. Jennifer, Jessica has put up my personal email, which any of you all can use at any absolute time, but you can also reach me through our OKC Voices email as well. I respond to both. And then I see, Sarah, your hand is up.
Thank you. I just wanted to respond to your question about holes and where we need to fill in. I really feel like we need to contact representatives from our autistic community because there are a lot of police interactions that happen, and their community members are at risk in a big way as well. So I would suggest that we look to bridge that gap. And I actually know some families who would be willing to help in that way, and I can connect you. Also, in my community, we do a lot of flyers. So there are a lot of community members who don't have Wi-Fi access, but who do regularly go to community centers, less now because of COVID, but in tribal community centers or IHS and places, Indian Health Services, places like that are a great place to capture my community members' attention. And then there was one other suggestion. Oh, I was just going to let you know, Kendra and I will host an Indigenous listening session in the community, and we've got space, I believe in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, depending on where we want to focus. So thank you.
Perfect, thank you. For that.
I'm sorry, I still don't know how to use the hand raise.
Oh,
thing.
it's fine. I'm looking around the room. Whoever's speaking, go ahead.
This is Gloria. This is Gloria Torres.
Oh, there you go. Okay, hello.
So I believe Dr. Font had to step out, but I work very closely with Dr. Font, and both of us work extensively in the Hispanic community. And much as what Sarah just mentioned, for the different reasons, having it on paper is a big piece to be able to walk them through it and even transcribe for some. Just, go ahead and just write it out for them. Some of them want to do it themselves, but it's definitely a in-person, face-to-face type. Sorry, I think somebody's setting off fireworks. At least I hope it's fireworks. So face-to-face, I also have a couple of networks where we can host community gatherings as well. We hosted one this morning that was well attended, and it's a mixed audience. But the other thing was I sent out the flyer. I'm sure somebody put a lot of effort into translating that. However, I'd be more than happy to volunteer to proof prior to sending something out in the future. It is important that we respect the language of those that we're trying to communicate with and use as much proper grammar as possible.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think there is a service that the city uses. And so certainly we can speak with Kenton and make sure that there is a way to run it by folks, just so we can be sensitive to those issues, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you. And just so you all know, this is something that we're working on, so I'm not exactly ready to break it out, but one of the things that we've been thinking about is, kind of man on the street interviews, if you will. So that folks are not having to write stuff down. They don't have the internet, but people may have an iPhone or a cell phone. Not the people we want to get the information from, but people on the task force or people that we work with, so that we can get videos that can be uploaded, that can be as a part of outreach as well. So when we get more details about how to do that, I'll circle back around with you all. I see the hour is 4:30, and I respect anybody that has to drop off. Please respond to the survey. If it's something that is not clear, always reach out to us at either one of those emails. But I thank you all for showing up. I thank you for showing up as your full selves and bringing everything to these meetings. I do see some other hands up, so I'm gonna call on those, but respect anybody that needs to leave. I think Nikki, I saw your hand, but then it might have gone away.
Yes, I lowered it only as you were speaking, but I just wanted to echo what we just heard as far as the flyer was concerned. It was very difficult to really engage people in that. And I know a lot of the issue, one is as the conversation for us to ask people to respond. Again, with those barriers, it's very difficult for people to do that, one. And I personally was very hesitant to share it, but I knew we needed to in order for us to get the momentum moving for responses. But is there a way for us to create something just a little more appealing for people to really get? We need their input. And I know there was a conversation from someone that basically said this was done on short notice and we asked you all to do that, but we did, while we just asked if there was something we could share, we also said, take your time. We just want to make sure we get it out. And we waited almost 2 weeks to get it, and this is what we got. So that's the difficulty in
what we're trying to do as far as begin the conversations in the community. And even with me being able to share that, I got 2 people that sent inbox messages to to the Facebook page that I sent it from. And obviously they didn't want to respond in that manner because they responded to me.
Yes, and thank you, Councilwoman, for bringing that up. I have sent a couple of emails to folks. While they didn't ask for my apology, I apologized because, you know, as we've even seen on these calls where people with the best intentions say something and then we have our community members to correct our behavior. So the first thing that I want to say is at any time, at any point, call me out. I have thick skin and this is your community and this is your process. And to the gentleman that I sent an email to this morning, if you know my history and you know my background, the last thing that I ever want to do is make anybody feel like this process is not for them. And so I think that was a mistake on our part to try to rush something because of the response or to try to be responsive. That was definitely a lesson learned. And so what I would say in the future, if you don't mind, is to send it back and say, yeah, this is not the quality that we're looking for our community. Try again, you know? And so I apologize for that. And certainly we are going to be, have our antenna up moving forward to make sure that what we're doing is responsive and inclusive. So thank you for that feedback, and we will definitely work on that as we move forward.
Goodell, I have one issue that I need to make with the group. During our last meeting, I think Sherry Adams Cornell gave us a list, and one of the items on there was to add some people from different organizations to the task force, understanding that, of course, the mayor appointed all of the members of the task force. And so we would have to take names to him in order to add members to it. The mayor, when we talked to the mayor about this issue, he was very receptive to adding people from those organizations, but he needed recommendations on a couple of those organizations. One of the organizations was a behavioral health organization, and the other was the autistic community. That he indicated that if you all will provide, or whoever is interested in this would provide a recommendation to him of the name of someone for that he would certainly consider that to add as a member of the group. He has already indicated that he was willing to add someone to the group on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And Craig Freeman, if you're still here, would you explain to them who that is that he he said he would add?
Yes, and I'm not thinking of her name right now, but it's the chairman. I think we talked about it before, but it's the chairman of the mayor's mayor's committee on disability concerns. And so that he felt like it was only appropriate, since he has that committee, that he would have that person serve on there. And I'll get the name, and I apologize, I don't have her name right here with me.
So far, we have not received any recommendations, but if you do have a recommendation, just to make it easy, everybody knows how to get in touch with Sharita. So if you just send that information to her, then we will get that information to the mayor and see if we can't get that process underway, okay? Anisha, you have anything else?
No, sir, I do not. Like I said, I just again thank you all for showing up and being part of this. And we will be sending out the notes that we took and more information on the subcommittee so that we can move forward with scheduling those meetings.
You can go ahead and email us any contacts more that you think of as you're starting to process through this. We're fully prepared to receive that and look forward to it.
This is Councilperson Cooper. Would it be possible for someone at their convenience maybe to reach out to me? I definitely responded in the survey saying that I am more than happy to be a part of any virtual meetings, but I would like to kind of get a better sense of what it's looked like previously when you're working with council members, like how we can make sure that as many folk in the community as possible within Ward 2 specifically are able to participate, but then also how do we drill down, you know, I mean, as I've said before, Ward 2 has the historic Asian district, the historic LGBT district. We have a Native American population. Like we have a lot of diversity with the Boys and Girls Club, and I see some overlap there with the youth outreach conversation. So I both would like to know, and we don't have to have that answer right now, but I'd like to know how it can be more of a Ward 2 writ large conversation, but then drilling down into some of those historic districts and some of those communities that are going to want to be part of the conversation.
Absolutely, Councilman Cooper. I've gone ahead and taken that note, and Ganesha or I will be in touch to help walk through that process to see what would work best for your constituency, your own thoughts based on our experience.
Appreciate y'all. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I don't see any more hands up. I know we're losing people based on the time. We actually had to lose Ganesha too. She apologizes. So we can follow up with email if that's the easiest. And we have been receiving your surveys. Thank you, Dr. Thompson. I know she'll be interested in talking to you directly as soon as you're available. And so I think MT, I can turn it back over to you.
Okay, and I just simply wanted to say, first of all, thank you, 21CP, for your work today. And even more so than that, thank you, Task Force, for your participation, for your interest and your comments today. I really enjoyed that. I learned a lot from everybody, and hopefully we can make the same progress in future meetings. Anybody else have any further comments before we sign off? Thank you for those of you who stuck around late. I understand some had to leave, but thank you for sticking around and continuing the conversation.
I just wanted to add a huge thank you to Sharita Rice from the city. She has been my point of contact, and I can only imagine how difficult it is to kind of get all of us together in one place on a continuous basis, but then to also make sure that, you know, all of this stuff, I try to get it to her on time, and I am often late, and she is very graceful with that. So I'm going to get this over to her and create some more work for her. But I just wanted to give her a shout out for all the hard work she does for us.
Thank you.
AMT, I noticed too that AJ Pittman, Representative Pittman, has her hand up.
I just see that. AJ, go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. And I know everyone has to go, but I just wanted to second what Councilman Cooper said. It may be helpful for you to kind of tell the elected officials in the group what you need from us, because all of us represent different constituencies. So if we know what we're looking for, or different populations in our communities or our constituency that we represent, that we can connect you with and reach out to, I think that will be helpful for us so that we know how to help this group even more.
Happy to take care of that, Councilwoman Pittman, and I'll note that now.
Anyone else? Great meeting, everybody. Thank you. We are adjourned.